My name is McNeil, and I'm one of the conveners of this series. And today we're going to be having two of our guest speakers join us to talk about metrics and measurement. I became interested in having us talk about this as part of this seminar because my own work in disasters looks at uncertainty and management of that in the context of novel crises. And measurement and knowing what we can know or don't know and figuring out how to quantify things and what we can talk about in relation to disasters is something that really intersects with that. So I'm very excited to learn more. And with that, I want to turn over to our first speaker, who's joining us from the University of Calgary.
Thank you so much, Kate, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Tugba, and I'm a PhD candidate in the environmental design program at the University of Calgary, and my research broadly looks into people's recovery and response strategies in the event of extreme climate events, such as like wildfires or like extreme floods. So today let me share my screen starter. So my subject is called like person-place relationship in understanding people's response to extreme climate events through the people's lived experiences of Lytton Creek wildfire 2021. So before I jump in to the discussion, I wanted to briefly walk you through my research progress so far to give you a better understanding of the overall presentation. So when I first started my research, my focus was on communities that are displaced after experiencing hurricanes and who are resettling in elsewhere other than their home environment. So when I start diving deep into this subject, I realized that there's not enough data that shows like whereabouts of these peoples or where they go after experiencing such events and what are their choices for resettling in that specific area. So as a result, I shifted my focus more towards communities that are displaced, but who are living in nearby communities with the hope that they will go back to their own home environment and rebuild their lives. So for this subject, I focus on wildfire cases, and I specialize in a wildfire that happened in 2021 in British Columbia, Canada. So with that in mind, today I will delve into the pressing issue of climate-induced internal displacement with a focus on person-place relationship and non-economic loss and damage framing in the face of extreme climate events. And as I present today, I will share insights from recent data on climate-induced internal displacement, particularly from 2021 and 2022, just to give you a brief understanding of the severity of the displacement caused by extreme climate events. And then I will discuss how this phenomenon is playing out in Canada specifically and what it means for the national discussion and policies. Then I will shift my focus to dive into federal government strategies for responding to such extreme events and how they align with the experiences of those directly affected. So I wanted to explore how the introduced policies align or misalign with the community's expectation and actual needs in the face of extreme events. Most importantly, I will touch on the deep connection between people and their places and how these bonds actually are impacted by these events and the broader implications for community recovery. So to bring all this into life, I will take you through the recovery journey of Lytton community members following the fire that reshaped their life significantly. So To begin with, I wanted to give you a brief description of the definitions I used for this research, because these terms are actually have multiple definitions, and depending on the context, their meanings might vary slightly. So the first one is climate-induced displacement. Climate-induced displacement, as you all know, refers to people who, due to compelling reasons of sudden or progressive change in their environment that significantly affect their lives or living conditions. And this is why they're forced to leave their home environment or choose to do so, basically, either temporarily or permanently. They may relocate within their own country or move elsewhere. So the second definition is about place. Place and space sometimes used interchangeably, but place is more like a concept that emerges from individual and collective experiences and the process of meaning making that occurs within and with the space itself. It evolves based on the ongoing individual experiences, and it serves as an object of attachment. It serves as a space for people to develop their identity and their belonging. And the person-place relationship is basically a framework that captures the affective bond that people develop with places. It is a subjective framework where the meanings associated with a place can vary based on the individual experiences and perception of the space. And the last one is non-economic loss and damage. This term is relatively new, newly introduced framing. Before, it was used only as non-economic loss, but in 2023, they included the damage aspect of the overall concept. And the concept refers to the adverse climate-driven impacts on things of value that are not commonly traded in the market. So rather than focusing on the tangible aspects, non-economic loss and damage refers to intangible aspect of the intangible impacts of the events, basically. While recovery from such impacts is possible in some cases, but it's not universally so. So loss of well-being and damage to well-being are distinct concepts in this regard, and recognizing both of them suggests that interventions cannot universally support recovery from non-economic impacts. That's why a need for culturally and contextually informed design, like policy design, is required in climate emergencies. So with these definitions in mind, I first wanted to share some data or some maps relevant to internal displacement to help. If you already know, this might be a little bit boring, but if you don't, this will give you the severity, help you understand the severity of the internal displacement that is stemmed from extreme events, or the, as it's called, disasters, basically. And the trajectory of internal displacement in this regard has been evolving over the past decade. With 2021, this specific map shows a marking continuation of this concerning pattern. And the map reveals not only incremental changes, but also substantial escalation, with more people being impacted than ever before in the worldwide. Oops. And this graphic basically show the distribution of displacement mode based on the violation and conflict, as well as disaster-induced displacement. And this breakdown basically show us a concerning trend in the number of disasters that are increasing worldwide. So weather-related extreme events have not only surpassed the geophysical one, as you can see, approximately 1.4 million people were impacted by geophysical disasters, but almost like maybe 10 times, maybe 20 times more than the geophysical ones. 22.3 million people were impacted by weather-related events and displaced as a result. And this data is a stark illustration of increasing frequency and intensity of such events worldwide, and their growing impact on people's lives, basically. And it highlights the necessity of understanding and preparing for these events as a significant and escalating threat to communities. So here also I wanted to have your attention to the number of people who are impacted by wildfires. As you can see, it is the third biggest weather-related event that caused displacement worldwide now. So this map and graphs, I wanted to share the severity of this subject, especially in Canada, and its relevance with wildfire. And also I will talk a little bit about the misalignment with the data we have and the actual events that are going on. So the examination of internal displacement due to climate events in 2022 with a lens on Canada's last decade and the prevalence of wildfires reveals a significant limitations in the data projection. The table you can see on the right side shows only recorded like 73 wildfires over a decade. But the reality is that only 1,600 wildfires happened in Canada only in 2021. So this discrepancy, like while one graph shows like 73 wildfires, the reality we know is way more than this. And this discrepancy basically highlights the vagueness in disaster definition and modes, which obstructs the comprehensive understanding from these graphs. Basically, like if we just look into these maps, we can say that, okay, like it's happening, but when we calculate the number of wildfires or overall disasters for the last 10 years, we see approximately like 2012 disasters with only like 73 wildfires. This influenced the way we frame the severity of issue in the country. And these data challenges basically stem from the collection practices that are often ceased shortly after the disaster happens. And this hinders our grasp of ongoing displacement realities among communities. And even with improved methodologies in data collection, problems persist due to uneven data availability, underreporting of like smaller or isolated events, and the invisibility of internally displaced people. And this inconsistency in terminology and reliance on housing distraction as a proxy in data collection, basically, on a displacement, further complicates the accuracy of the estimation, because when we just focus on the housing distraction as a proxy to understand the number of people who are displaced, we may not be able to understand the real displacement that the people experience during the process. And these findings basically underline the imperative for redefined data collection approach to capture the full scope of the displacement in the wake of disasters. So, oops, I think, can you give me a second? I think I opened the wrong, sorry, wrong presentation, just a second. So, oh. All right. Huh. I'm really sorry about this. All right. All right. All right. I'm really sorry about this again. So basically, these limitations I explored in data collection practices and the situation in Canada, I listed some of the limitations to data-driven understanding of climate-induced displacement, especially in Canada. So in exploring Canada's climate trends, a series of limitations have come to light, basically. Foremost among this is the absence of clear definition for climate displacement within Canada policy framework. So there is no definition what constitutes climate-induced displacement and who are the climate-induced displaced populations, basically. And this lack of understanding poses a significant challenge as it hampers the development of laws and policies aimed at protecting and supporting people during in the face of extreme events. And additionally, there is a noticeable scarcity of research at the national level focused on climate-induced displacement, which further hindering our ability to comprehend and address this issue. And moreover, like the other limitation I realized is that there is an inadequate emphasis on analyzing displacement policies, leading to gaps in understanding of effective response and strategies. And this disruption in data reporting and the absence of tracking mechanisms for extreme events exacerbate these challenges, making it difficult to accurately assess the scale and the impact of the displacement in the face of disasters. Furthermore, the variations in how climate-induced change and emergency response are framed contribute to a lack of coherency in our approach to address displacement again. And the other item is that at the federal government level, the emergency response and recovery practices or framework is quite vague, and it's hard to understand what are the main criteria or what are the main support mechanisms that are provided immediately after the event happens, basically. And this highlights basically for clearer guidance and decisive actions in safeguarding vulnerable populations and communities in the face of displacement stemmed from extreme climate events. And when we consider these methodological and practical issues in the country for data monitoring practices, there is a need in contextualizing the understanding in the community's narratives and perspectives to grasp the essence of the impacts until we see further development in data collection practices. So that's why basically I decided to focus on a qualitative research in which I highlight or I work with communities to show what is actually happening to people in the face of extreme climate events. And with this in mind, the first question I ask is what is addressed and what is lacked in the face of, such events, especially in Canada or worldwide. And when I start to, make a very basic, very generic research on the subject, what I realized is that the emphasis is highly on the financial aspect, the tangible impacts of the event. Like we know how many buildings were impacted, like how many buildings were destructed, or we know the cost of the event exactly, and we know whether the infrastructure improved or not, impacted or not, and if so, what is the cost of that damage, basically. But what we don't know and what is going on within communities after such events, we see that people grieve deeply and people experience trauma responses because the event itself becomes a source of trauma for them. And in the aftermath, people mostly are still exposed to the impacts of the event. And this contributes to their grief. And the more it takes for them to recover, the more exposure they have to trauma. So in the case of Canada, for instance, it takes approximately minimum around 5 years to complete, like quote unquote, complete the recovery of an environment after a disaster. So for this 5 consecutive years, people are under stress and they are still experiencing the grief and the mourning and the trauma responses after experiencing these events. So within this action slash basically solution-oriented framing of the emergency management, there is no emphasis on person-place relationship and its role in understanding human behavior that shape their response and recovery. Because what we know is that people's relationship with the place influence their place-based decisions and response. Basically, the meanings associated with a place influence how people respond to certain changes in their environment. And the loss of home as a result of sudden change in place lead to traumatic reactions. People experience stress, depression, grief, or emotional disorientation. And the loss and the after effect of loss influence how the place is experienced and people's relationship with that specific place. But when we look into the subject, basically from displacement and person-place relationship scholarship, we realize that recovery actually happens when people recover their relationship with the place. So in the case of forced displacement, when people get a chance to mimic their lost home environment, which is the cultural landscape, and when they transfer their place-based experiences by bridging similarities between pre- and post-change environment, they can start the actual recovery. So when we talk about recovery, providing financial support or giving them the insurance money is not enough for them to recover. So in order for them to recover, while we provide all these monetary means, there is a need for addressing their the non-economic loss and damage aspect of the event to help them provide a full package for the recovery. So in this case, I try to understand why cultural landscape basically help people in the recovery process. And then I realized cultural landscape offers a sense of familiarity, sense of solace, and having that familiar environment basically evokes positive association and memories attached to that place so that they can transfer all these new, not new, but all these experiences in rebuilding their lives. But in the face of climate-induced extreme events, the issue is that the landscape in most cases are either irreversibly destructed or, temporarily in an unknown condition. But what we see in this case, for instance, in wildfires, we see that the loss of the whole forest, and people who live nearby those forests associate their identity and their belonging deeply with that space. But losing that space basically disrupt their recovery, because the items that provide a sense of familiarity to them, or like sense of solace, is completely gone. And what we see in such events, we see that people still live nearby home landscape that is altered by the extreme event. And this cause a traumatic exposure to the stressor, and it leads a longitudinal impacts on non-economic loss and damage. Because let's say in the case of Lytton wildfire, the wildfire happened in 2021, and as of now, people still have minimum access to their places, like the remaining of their houses, basically. But they still live in nearby communities. And this proxy to their home environment, their previous home environment, cause constant source of stress and source of like traumatic exposure to them. And this exposure is basically defined as a psychotherapeutic illness and it is an illness when people's well-being is threatened by the severity of healthy links between themselves and their home landscape. And as a result of this illness, people experience longing, homesickness, and they constantly show the sign of trauma responses. And together, they influence people's place-based experiences and their perception on the place. And this shift in their perception shape people's recovery process, because they become more and more hopeless, they feel more stressed, and this basically influence how people react and respond to the policies that are introduced for these people to help them to recover. And this longitudinal exposure to the stressor basically delays post-event recovery processes. But there is a way to address this trauma exposure, and there is a way to help us address how to better navigate people in the face of such events. And during my research, like in the first phases, when I was working on the methodology, I realized that addressing people's non-economic loss and damage is possible basically through a trauma-informed approach, in which the methodology centers itself in reflexive and participatory action research methodologies. So this way, rather than me as a researcher talking about their perception, they are becoming part of the knowledge production, so that together we can frame and we can produce the knowledge to show what people need in the face of recovery and what was their experience since the fire happened or since the event happened. Like these methodologies that are informed by trauma-informed approach can offer a strength-based approach to our understanding. So rather than just writing a scientific paper, during the process in which me as a researcher and the community members as co-researchers, when we collaborate and produce knowledge, this also offered them an empowering pathway for them to become more and more resilient for the future events. And the sense of community basically thrives in such a context as well. So in this case, rather than a refraction model, a diffractive approach to enhancing the framing of recovery and response can become a possibility, because in refraction model, as you can see from the right bottom, like the policy, like let's assume that the arrow is the policy itself and the target is the community, and what is observed from the above level of the water doesn't actually show us the depth and the actual position of the community in such cases. So the address or the designed proposed policy doesn't meet the targeted community's needs. But in the diffraction model, we see that the people are stating and showing their responses and explaining how the event and how the policies basically help or didn't help to them, can help us reach out to a broader community, because this will lead an empathetical framework for people to hear each other. And this, in a way, ground the framing of the issue in the perception of community members. And it offers a relatable and relevant framing of climate-induced extreme events and displacement. And it also contributes to exerting pressure on the relevant policy planning and implementation, rather than putting the spotlight on the communities. And this overall exemplifies the role of contextual and cultural understanding and its role in the policy framing. So I also wanted to briefly talk about my case study, which is the Lytton Creek fire. So in Lytton in 2021, the city, like the Lytton is a small town, and the town experienced the highest temperature ever measured in the country, with 49.5 degrees Celsius. And within a day, maybe within an afternoon, basically, the whole town was destroyed by the wildfire, and people had only minutes to leave their home environment. So although they left, they are still living in nearby communities, because they are hopeful that they will go back and rebuild their lives and rebuild their communities once again. But the policies offered for the recovery and policies offered for the recovery basically unfolds extremely slow, and the information communities receive is extremely overwhelming, and this delays people's recovery efforts significantly. And I wanted to, if you can hear, hopefully, I wanted to share a small video with you to, show you a brief segment from a community member who saw their home environment after the wildfire. And I just wanted you to, focus on the reaction she gave once she saw the remaining of the place. But before I go in, I wanted to ask you if you can hear the video.
Might it be better for you to put this into the chat and people can watch it afterwards? I'm just conscious of time and I don't know.
All right. Okay, then I will just move on. No worries. So in this video, basically, the woman saw her place and she just starts crying because, like, she remembers all of her memories and everything. So The non-economic loss and damage framework basically give us a guideline to better understand and better frame what needs to be addressed in the face of such events. And these are the testimonies that are coming from the people basically who experience, who share their part of the story. And as you can see, like none of them basically talks about the financial impacts of these events. But before I close, I wanted to just share that there is hope in the face of such events and ways to help people recover. Because people, if they share their stories and their part of the experience together or with a broader community, they start to feel like they are being heard, and this helps them to feel more and more empowered. And with this overall framing in mind, like my main takeaways and the future directions, I wanted to share them with you because within all of this discussion, what I realized is that there is a need for broadening research to include diverse personal stories from those impacted by extreme events. And there is a need for studying long-term psychosocial effects of displacement on communities' recovery and response while we still work on the data-driven research. Because enhancing data collection and tracking for informed climate displacement response, as well as like the psychosocial impacts of these events, if we unfold both of them simultaneously or hand in hand, this can give us a better way of framing the future policies in the face of climate emergencies. And in this regard, like fostering a transdisciplinary study framing where multiple disciplines and multiple ways of knowing come together can deepen insights into non-economic loss and damage in relation to person-place relationship. And of course, like there is a need for advocating for policy coherency and its implementation that are culturally and contextually informed. So I think these are all, and there will be another video, but I think, yeah, I will share.
Every time I come to Lytton, my body feels
I'm sorry, I'm just
energized.
conscious of time. Could you maybe drop this in and we could switch on to our next speaker?
Oh, sure, of course.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank you.
And yes, please do drop those links into the chat so that way people can watch them in their time afterwards.
And I'm sorry if I took so much of your time.
No, this is incredibly interesting. I just want to make sure that we have enough time for Melanie as well. Melanie, do you want to turn to your presentation?
Yes, hold on, let me switch. Please give me a thumbs up if you can see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, awesome, fantastic. So Tugba, thank you so much. So I think this is really interesting because we're going to be sort of the ends of the spectrums to some degree in terms of, the way we look at metrics and what kind of metrics we use. So I did not design this presentation as a traditional like research presentation. So I'm trying to keep it a little bit more informal and really just present you some of the metrics that I am using and then maybe have a conversation. So I'm going to try to be quick to maybe do this in 10 minutes so that we have some time for discussion. So I would like to share with you some information on the disaster loss database that I manage for the United States, show you a new data product that we're offering that we're calling US Disaster Normals, and then show you a national risk index that was developed here for the United States by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, just as a sort of pointer, something for you maybe to take away from this meeting to look into. And then also show you an application that we've developed called Hazard Aware that maybe uses metrics in a different way to what you might have experienced before. So I manage the Spatial Hazard Events and Losses database called SHIELDUS. It lives here at Arizona State University. And this database was originally developed, initiated by Dr. Susan Cutter at the University of South Carolina. And I almost consider this database like, it's not a human child, but I feel very much like it is a child of mine, because I started working on this database when I was a PhD student under Susan Cutter. And then when I moved to Arizona State University, the database moved with me. So in this database, to Tugba's point, oh, we have so much information on the economic impacts. In this database, we document direct damage from natural hazards, all natural hazards, and we document the direct damage from properties, on properties, crop injuries, and fatalities. But I have to say, Tugba said, you know, we have all this data out there. Even though we have this data, it is still poor, and the degree to which these estimates are accurate varies. It varies by hazard type, it varies by state and location. So even though we produce this database at a really, you know, at an operational level, we update it every year, etc., the data is not perfect. So these concerns and issues that we have data on economic impacts, but not on non-economic, the sort of more intangible, is absolutely accurate. But I would like to add that even the estimates we have on the economic impacts are very, very poor. So when you look at, for instance, our database, we don't have information on the indirect economic impacts. You know, what does it cost people to be out of work? What does it cost, you know, businesses to shut down? What does it cost, you know, when you have prolonged health recovery, if you maybe you have mental health issues from an event? All of that is not captured in these economic estimates that we provide. So there's a tension, you know. It's good that we have metrics and measures, but what we generally have, I would say, is not as good as it possibly should be to adequately, you know, design policies and strategies around managing these impacts. So here's just a quick glimpse on the data that we're including, or sort of how the database has evolved over time. So you can see the numbers of fatalities, the losses, everything has gone up. It generally does. We do a very poor job here in the US in terms of curbing the impacts of losses. That has not happened despite all the investments that happened in hazard mitigation. This is just a broad outline of sort of where the losses in the US mostly occur. So they are very much in the coastal US, you see very much in California. But here the challenge is also what you see is what we measure is absolute losses. So the more people, the more stuff is in a place, the more losses do you have. So this map does not account, for instance, for population density or the size of a county. So when you look at measures like this, you also kind of have to keep this in mind, that there is to some degree like visual distortion when you interpret these impacts. We use data from federal resources, from federal sources, the National Weather Service, the US Geological Survey, our key data sets. And one of the questions that I often get when people use our data, when they contact us, inquire about the data, is this, you know, oh, should I use a certain cutoff of losses that I look at? And, you know, do you have a mechanism to only look at big events or extreme events? And that kind of led us to try to develop this new metric, which we call US disaster normals. And it mimics, we really adopt the methodology, the approach to a data product that already exists, that is the US climate normals that are compiled by the Weather Service. And there really the goal is to look at which weather phenomenon is above, below, you know, at a certain level, what is considered extreme, what is normal. And so we had this question, you know, what is a normal loss for the state of Louisiana versus maybe Illinois or something like this. So based on the data in our disaster database, we really then try to look at, you know, what makes up for extreme losses. Can we possibly use this product? We are not answering this question, but can we maybe use this product to look at long-term changes, trends over time, and is there may be a way to connect both products, the climate normals and the disaster normals, to look at the effects or a signal of climate change. So this disaster normals products, and we have a paper under review right now, which hopefully we soon, get feedback on and get it out. What we're doing is we are slicing our data into two 30-year time periods. So we have a reference normal, it's 1961 through 1990, and then 1991 through 2020, the conventional normal. And these terms are completely adopted from the climate normals product that already exists. What we're doing, however, is we are not separating property damage and crop damage and then the sort of human losses, injuries, and fatalities. We are actually monetizing or converting injuries and fatalities in a monetary value by adopting the value of statistical life. So we are converting every fatality into a value of 11.6 million and every injury into a $1.16 million value. So in the climate normals, injuries and property and crop damage are combined. So we offer different metrics in terms of, these disaster normals, similar to the US climate normals. So you can download data in terms of what is the observed annual loss. This is what OAL stands for. Underneath in bracket is the reference normal and the conventional normal. So these two 30-year time periods. And the reason why we call this observed annual losses is because many of you might be familiar with the engineering field where you have average annual losses. And there's a lot of modeling assumptions that usually go into calculating these average annual losses. In our case, we are truly only working with historic observed damage. What you can also see is that the interannual standard deviation is very high because obviously there are massive differences from year to year, depending on the events that occur, the magnitude of the disasters that occur, and there's also tremendous variation by state. So right now we only offer this at the state level and not at the county level due to this tremendous variation. And I highly doubt that we ever do this at the county level because you just have this extreme events distribution and many years maybe of missing losses at the county level. So I'm going to skip because I see we only have 10 minutes left. I can refer you to maybe the paper down the road. And one application that I want to share with you is from FEMA, the National Risk Index. And this might include some measures that you are familiar with. So the National Risk Index is intended as a product that gives US counties a sense of how risky, I'm putting this in quotation mark, a county might be with regard to various different natural hazards. And I want to also point out that maybe when you look at this product, you're like, oh, this looks very similar to Shieldus in terms of the hazards that are shared, et cetera. And that is because they use our data as one of their key data sources to generate the average annual losses. But they also use metrics like social vulnerability. They use metrics for resilience. And you see here, they have an algorithm, a mathematical approach to calculating this risk index. So they divide social vulnerability by community resilience and then multiply it with average annual losses. I think there's a ton to Kate's point about uncertainty. I think there's, we could have, 10 of these sessions to discuss maybe how this metric is constructed and the uncertainty that might go into this measure. But I want to also show you an example of something that might be slightly unusual to what you've seen when it comes to these measures. And that is also that sometimes we can use these measures as an educational tool, as an informational tool, not as an absolute measurement. And together with my colleague, Chris Emmerich, we developed an application called Hazard Aware. You can find it at hazardaware.org. You can just type in an address, pick a random address. It's done for the US coast, the Gulf Coast, given our funder, which is the National Academies of Sciences Gulf Research Program. And there we devised a metric that is intended not to measure in an absolute sense, what is the social vulnerability or environmental vulnerability or impacts. But this is meant as a metric that informs users about how much risk they take on in buying or living in a certain property. So maybe some of you are familiar with this. Sometimes we see these kinds of measures or these kinds of sort of informational metrics when it comes to maybe energy saving appliances or sort of ratings of school quality or something like this. It's not necessarily an absolute measurement, but it gives you a sense of, you know, how the product that you're using performs, but not necessarily in absolute terms. So before I close out, I want to point out, and I saw we have a representative of OECD in our group. So there is 2 resources. If you think about constructing, developing composite measures in the disaster space, to me, I have to say, I've used the handbook on constructing composite indicators by the OECD for years. I think it's the gold standard on how you should think about compiling these measures, how well, or, you know, the degree of testing you should be doing, uncertainty testing, sensitivity testing, documenting it in your research, so that you just don't say, oh, this is our metric and this is what we have. You know, how did you arrive at this metric? What are some of the decision points during the process of constructing this metric? And then I also want to highlight the Joint Research Center's Competence Center on Composite Indicators on Scoreboards, called COIN. So those 2 sources I would really highly recommend if you're thinking about doing research and working in this space. And that's it, Kate. Sorry, I tried to rush through it. Happy to share the slides.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to you both. Does anyone have questions? We can sort of take maybe 10, 15 minute